Guten Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. It is great to be with you on a Friday afternoon. That was the Moshav Band doing their version of Yedid Nefesh on their album Shabbos or Shabbat Volume 1. We're going to be working our way through that album for a while during the warm-up music. Let's light up the darkness. We have a lot to cover today. This is a big page with a lot of really beautiful teaching, so we're going to keep it moving. It's Elul. We're in that last bit. We're really getting ready. We're getting psyched up for Rosh Hashanah now. With us as we get together to do some learning on a Friday. Stephen in New Hampshire, Paul in the great Northwest, Yehudit in South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Paul in Chicago, Tom wishing everyone a good Shabbos, Hannah in New York, Belle in Illinois. Okay, where am I? What am I doing? Hold on a second, make sure that's off. All right. It's a busy page. Let us get right into it. Where are we holding? This is page 51 of Tractate Sukkah. The tractate ends on page 56. We're really getting near the end. And as often happens when we get toward the end of a tractate of the Talmud, the rabbis are, of course, covering the laws that they mean to cover, but they also start just kind of like adding other teachings, folkloric teachings, wisdom teachings, moral teachings, historical teachings, and often the most fascinating stuff can be found near the end of the tractates, and we're definitely starting to get into an area like that here in Tractate Sukkah. This tractate has 5 chapters. We are in chapter 5. Today we're completing our discussion of the first Mishnah and getting into the second Mishnah, which has a very, very famous line. Just a quick preview. We'll get to it in just a few minutes. But a quick preview. One who did not see, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water never saw celebration in all his days. And we're going to get a play-by-play of what the most magnificent party in the history of the world was like. Okay, we open near the bottom of the B side of page 50. Rav Papa said, so this first mission, chapter 5, was about the flute. And I shared a little teaching, in fact, with the general accidental Talmudist audience this morning that we covered yesterday, right? That the flute was a wooden flute, the flute of Moses, was this wooden flute, and early in the temple history, they tried to plate it with gold to make it nicer, but it didn't sound better, and they realized they needed to take off that gold plating. The question that's really been asked is, would the flute playing happen on the first day of the festival and on Shabbos, when generally speaking, musical instruments are prohibited? But that's an ordinance of the sages to prevent the average Jew from coming to transgress Shabbos or Yom Tov by playing an instrument, breaking the instrument, getting the instrument repaired, etc. And many of these types of rabbinic ordinances were not in effect in the precincts of the temple compound itself, because the priests would administer those areas, and they knew very well what the laws were of the priesthood, of the avodah, the divine service, and whether or not they were risking coming to transgress Shabbos. So they didn't need that extra help from the rabbis, as it were. And there were instruments played, it would appear, we're going to get more into that, on Shabbos or not. We're still debating this question. What it would matter. Some instruments were played on Shabbos, and as we'll see, the question is, do those musical instruments being played in the temple which are accompanying the bringing of offerings, are they an essential component of bringing offerings? And offerings were brought on Shabbos. The daily offering was brought on Shabbos. The additional offering that's special for Shabbos was brought on Shabbos. And so the song that accompanied the offerings would also be played. And the question is, was the essence of that song the voices of the Levites in the choir, or was the essence of that song the musical instruments which accompanied them? The essence of the song is going to accompany the offerings. So if the essence is the musical instruments, they're going to accompany the offerings even on Shabbos. But if the essence is the singing of the Levites, then perhaps the musical instruments will not. That's where we're headed. Rav Papa said, Rav Yosef stated that the dispute between Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda and the rabbis concerning whether or not the flute, which was considered the most significant of the instruments, whether that flute overrides Shabbos and festivals, and the question is based on the significance and the role of the song in the sacrifice of the offerings, meaning that the song has two components, the voices of the Levites and the musical instruments. So this dispute is parallel to another dispute between Tanaim, meaning the rabbis of the Mishnah, as it is taught in a Mishnah in Tractate Arachin. The temple musicians were slaves of priests. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yosef says the musicians were not slaves. They were Israelites from the family of the house of Hapigarim and the family of the house of Tzippareah. And they were from the city of Emaum, and their lineage was sufficiently distinguished that they would marry their daughters to members of the priesthood. Right, that's sort of like by lineage, the most respected lineage. I mean, unless technically you're descended from King David. Other than that, the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother, are the Kohanim, right? The hereditary priesthood. And they're going to have their pick of who they want to marry, right? And so, to sort of marry into the priestly families is going to be reserved for very distinguished people. And here they're saying, well, the musicians who played in the temple, weren't just, sort of like musicians playing in a bar band, right? They were very distinguished people, and they were sufficiently distinguished to marry into the priestly families. Rabbi Hanina ben Antigonus says they were Levites. The musicians in the temple were Levites. And what? Is it not that they disagree with regard to this point? That the one who said that the musicians were slaves holds that the primary essence of the song, which accompanies the offerings, is singing with the mouth. That was definitely done by the Levites. Since the instrumental music is just an accompaniment, it could be performed even by slaves. And the one who said that the musicians were Levites holds that the primary essence of the song which accompanied the offerings is the musical instrument component of that music. Therefore, the musicians also had to be Levites who were tasked with creating the song that was part of the temple service. And the Gemara answers, how can you understand the Mishnah in that way? According to that explanation, what does Rabbi Yosef hold, who had that intermediate position? If he holds that the primary essence of song is singing with the mouth, well, then even slaves can play the instruments. He's the one who said that they were Israelites of distinguished lineage. But if the essence of the song is the Levites singing with their mouths, then anybody could play the instruments. Why do they have to be distinguished Israelites? They could even be slaves. Or if one holds that the primary essence of the song is the musical instruments, well, then it would have to be played by Levites. Why would it be required that it would be Israelites of distinguished lineage? So there's no sense in either one of those positions, according to Rabbi Yosef, if what they're arguing about when they're arguing about the identity of who those musicians were is really, that argument is really based on which is the essential component of the music, whether the singing or the instruments. It must be that what's the root of this argument about what was the identity of those musicians is really depending on something else. Rather, the explanation of the dispute is that everyone agrees that the primary essence of song is singing with the mouth, and the musical instruments are merely an accompaniment. And it is with regard to this that they disagree. It is that one sage holds that the event took place in this manner, i.e., slaves played the instruments. That's the way that it worked out historically. And another sage holds that the event took place in this manner, i.e., that in fact it was Israelite families of distinguished lineage and not slaves. And the Gemara asks, well, what practical halachic difference is there whether one group or another played the instruments? If we're all agreeing that the essence of the song which accompanies the offerings is the Levites' choir singing with their mouths, what difference does it make who was playing the instruments? And what practical difference does it make? And the Gemara answers, it is with regard to whether one elevates a Levite from the platform to the presumptive status of distinguished lineage and eligibility to receive tithes that they disagree. If a family has a tradition in that family, historical, tradition that they've passed down, that sort of one of the ancestors of this family played an instrument on the platform in the temple, then do we assume that this family, therefore, is a Levite family and is entitled to the tithes which Levites receive? Or do we assume merely that this is a family of distinguished lineage, but not necessarily a Levite family? The one who said that the musicians were slaves holds that one does not elevate from the platform to the presumptive status of distinguished lineage or eligibility to receive tithes. The one who says that the musicians were Israelites elevates a family who had a member who played on that platform to the presumptive status of distinguished lineage, but not eligibility to receive tithes, meaning that they're Levites. And the one who said that the musicians were Levites holds that one elevates a Levite from the platform to the presumptive status of distinguished lineage and eligibility to receive tithes. If your ancestor played on that platform, father to son, father to son, father to son, then you must be a Levite, and you have distinguished lineage, and you're entitled to receive the tithes of a Levite. The Gemara cites an opinion that disagrees with that of Rav Yosef. Now we're going back to the initial discussion on our Gemara about the flute playing, where Rav Yosef said that the dispute with regard to whether the flute overrides Shabbos or not is with regard to the daily offerings. That's what Rav Yosef said. Does the flute which accompanies the daily offerings override Shabbos and Yom Tov or not? Now the Gemara is going to say, no, that's not what was really being discussed. What they were arguing about in the Mishna is whether or not the flute which accompanies the drawing of water from the pool of Shiloach, or in English Siloam, or Siloam, right? That drawing water from that pool and then bringing that water up for the water libations during Sukkot, that is the celebration of the water drawing, which was accompanied by musical instruments. Does the flute playing for the ceremony of water drawing, does that override Shabbos and Yom Tov or not? And that's hard to understand because, as we've seen, they don't draw water on Shabbos or the first day of the festival. They draw water previous to that because you can't draw water on Shabbos. So why would they be concerned about flute playing? But so then maybe now they're sort of extending, even though they don't draw water itself on Shabbos, they do have the water libation on Shabbos. And what about the instruments that accompany that? Do those instruments override Shabbos and Yom Tov or not? So the Gemara cites an opinion that disagrees with that of Rav Yosef. And Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said the dispute between Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda and the rabbis is with regard to the song of the drawing of the water, not the song of the daily offerings. Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda holds that the extra rejoicing does override Shabbos, and the rabbis who disagree with him hold that extra rejoicing does not override Shabbos. However, with regard to the song that the Levites sang accompanying the daily offerings, everyone agrees that it is part of the temple service and it does override Shabbos. And the Gemara recites an objection to the opinion of Rav Yosef, who said that the dispute is with regard to the song that the Levites sang accompanying the daily offerings. The song of the drawing of water override Shabbos. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. And the rabbis say it does not override even the festival. Apparently, their dispute is with regard to the song of the drawing of water, not the song which accompanies daily offerings. Say that this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Yosef, and the Gemara concludes, indeed, it is a conclusive refutation. The halacha. The added rejoicing of the song of the drawing of the water does not override Shabbos and Yom Tov. The song accompanying an offering. On 12 days of the year, the flute accompanies the bringing of the offerings. During the slaughter of the Paschal lamb on the first and second Passover, on the first day of Passover, on Shavuos, and on the 7 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. On those days, playing the flute overrides Shabbos, as according to the Gemara's conclusion, that was not subject to a Tanaitic dispute. And the Gemara suggests, let us say, based on this Baraisa, that it is with regard to the... I'm going to skip that. Now, what is the rationale for the opinion of the one who said the primary essence of song is singing accompanied by musical instruments? And the Gemara answers, it is as written, and Hezekiah commanded to sacrifice the burnt offerings upon the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord began also, and the trumpets together with the instruments of David, king of Israel, indicating that the song of God that accompanies the offering is played by trumpets and other instruments. The Gemara asks, well, what is the rationale for the opinion of the one who said the primary essence of the song is singing with the mouth? And the Gemara answers, it is as is written. These are both quotes from second book of Chronicles. The first one was from 29:27. This is second Chronicles 5:13. It is as is written, and it came to pass when the trumpeters and the singers were as one to make one sound. Since the verse does not mention any musical instrument played with the singing other than the trumpets, and the trumpets were not sounded as an accompaniment for the singers, apparently the primary essence of song is singing with the mouth. The trumpets were sounded in order to accompany the sacrifice of the daily and additional offerings with the requisite sounds of tekiah and teruah. And what are the halach on this? The primary essence of song in the temple, it is a mitzvah by Torah law to accompany the bringing of the offerings with song. This song was sung by the Levites, since the primary essence of song, which is the Levites' temple duty, is singing with the mouth. The musical instruments served merely as accompaniment and could be played by non-Levites. So it could be played by Israelites, and they would have distinguished lineage because they rose to that level of playing the temple. It could even be done by slaves of the priests. Who were the temple musicians? The temple musicians consisted of Levites and Israelites of lineage sufficiently distinguished that they could marry their daughters to priests, as only individuals of distinguished lineage were allowed on the temple platform, even if it was merely to play a musical instrument. So that's where that debate ended up. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 5. Now we go to Mishnah number 2. One who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of water, right? The Simchat Beis Hashueva, never saw celebration in his days. This was the sequence of events. It's a lovely little, they don't usually have these flourishes to introduce the laws stated in a Mishnah, but here they do. One who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing water never saw celebration in his days. And this was the sequence of events. At the conclusion of the first day of Sukkot, the first festival day, which in Israel is the only full-fledged festival day, just day 1 of Sukkot, at the conclusion of that first day, the priests and the Levites descended from the Israelites' courtyard to the women's courtyard, where they would introduce a significant repair, as the Gemara will explain. There were golden candelabra atop poles there in the courtyard. And there were 4 basins made of gold at the top of each candelabrum. And there were 4 ladders for each and every pole. And there were 4 children from the priesthood trainees. And in their hands were pitchers with a capacity of 120 lug of oil that they would pour into each and every basin. And from the worn trousers of the priests and their belts, they would loosen and tear strips to use as wicks. And with them, they would light the candelabra. And the light from the candelabra was so bright that there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that was not illuminated from the light of the place of the drawing of the water. So this was going on the Temple Mount, in the temple courtyard, the outer courtyard known as the women's courtyard. But that's the courtyard where, people could come. Not just priests could enter there. And they erected these very tall poles with huge golden basins that would contain oil. And then they were making big oil lamps. That's what they were doing, making very large oil lamps. And the wicks of these oil lamps were made from the worn out clothes of the priests that could no longer be used in their service of bringing the offerings, but had already been elevated to a holy purpose. Since they were the clothing of the priests, you have to dispose of them in the right way. And this was a beautiful, holy thing to do with them, to use them to light up Jerusalem, as it were, during this amazing celebration. And the pious and the men of action would dance before the people who attended the celebration. It's a really lovely image. The pious and the men of action. Right? And it's like you've almost got, and you could really see that in almost modern terms in the state of Israel, the pious, right? Like, so just think, the guys in black suits and black hats and long beards dancing alongside the soldiers, right? The men of action. What does it say here? Not everyone actively participated in the rejoicing of the place of the drawing of water. Only the sages of Israel, the pious, the learned elders, and the men of action would dance and play musical instruments in the temple, and the rest of the people came to watch and hear the celebration. So the dancing itself was an honor that was bestowed, on sort of the heroes of the nation, both because of their Torah learning or because of their courage in defending the nation. Where am I? So the pious and the men of action would dance before the people who attended the celebration, and with flaming torches that they would juggle in their hands, and they would say before them passages of song and praise to God. And the Levites would play on lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets, and countless other musical instruments. The musicians would stand on the 15 stairs that descend from the Israelites' courtyard to the women's courtyard, corresponding to the 15 songs of the ascents in Psalms, i.e. chapters 120 through 134, known as the Songs of Ascent, and upon which the Levites stand with musical instruments and recite their song. It's like you almost have that sense, and we have this, almost like if you think about the Capitol building and the great lawn in front of it in Washington, D.C. And it's very beautiful and it's very picturesque, and people take pictures of it, every day of the year. But you don't really see what that whole setup is all about until they have a presidential inauguration, and then all the stands come into place and all those locations and the portico and all the flags are draped, etc. And then you see what it's really been set up to do just once in a while when it's in its full glory. And that's the sense we're getting about the Sukkot celebrations in the temple. And this was the ceremony, and this was the ceremony of the water libation. 2 priests stood at the upper gate that descends from the Israelite courtyard to the women's courtyard with 2 trumpets in their hands. When the rooster crowed at dawn, right? So already we can just take a step back for a second and say when the rooster crowed at dawn is when they would do the water drawing. but they lit those massive candelabras that lit up all of Jerusalem at night. So they've been partying all night. Let's not rush past that. It's been an all-night party. And now when the rooster crows is going to be the climax of the party, when they're actually going to do the water drawing. That's not in the temple. Now, I have a nice little map here. This is some nice maps that you'll find in the new Koran Tanakh, the Koran Hebrew Bible. And here in the back, we're going to have like a little illustration. Let me see. It's a little bright. I apologize. Can you see that? Just trying to, I know it's bright and I don't want to catch the reflection. Okay, so what you see here, it's all backwards to me, but there's the Temple Mount, and they're going to descend, and so this is west, that's where the western wall is. East is out toward the sun and the Kidron Valley. South is to the city of David, and right down here, this little blue speck, that is the pool of Shiloach or Siloam. And that is where the water drawing is going to happen, where they're going to actually draw the water from that spring and then bring it back up to the Temple Mount, and that's what the water libations will be done with. While we're here, there's some just lovely illustrations that I'll share in passing. Right, this is the Mishkan. This is the tabernacle in the desert, surrounded by the array of the Israelites who've walked out of Egypt, right? So this is the 40 years that we were in the desert. That's what the tabernacle looked like. Once we entered the promised land, Joshua led us in. This is what the tabernacle looked like while it was housed in at Shiloh. So that's what it looked like while it was at Shiloh, a semi-permanent location for what was essentially a portable tabernacle. This is Solomon's temple on the site that David chose for it, really that God chose at the Temple Mount. And then Solomon built this temple. And then this is the late Second Temple. The early Second Temple was a modest structure. They didn't have the resources to do what Solomon had done. But then later, Herod built it up and vastly expanded that whole complex and put that large wall around the temple complex itself. And the western wall now, where we go to pray, is part of that outer wall around the whole Temple Mount. But the temple itself is that late Second Temple period temple is what we're always talking about and what the sages are talking about now in our discussion of where they were doing what, right? And so the steps that we're talking about, these 15 steps, are right here, if you can see that. Where they would descend from that inner courtyard to the outer courtyard. Okay. And then this is the third temple as described in Ezekiel's vision of it. And may we all merit to see it soon in our days, because we will see that temple when the Messiah comes. Okay. Where am I? Okay, so we're now talking about, so at dawn, right? At dawn, when the rooster crowed, they sounded the trumpets, tekiah, teruah, tekiah. And when they reached the women's courtyard with the basins of water in their hands, the trumpeters sounded tekiah, teruah, tekiah. And when they reached the ground of the women's courtyard, the trumpeters sounded a tekiah and a teruah and a tekiah. So it's this beautiful pageantry. And they would the priests who were bringing these basins for their water drawing would just go a few steps, and then the trumpets, and a few more steps, and then the trumpets, and the people are celebrating and watching. And like if you've seen a wedding or a coronation in England broadcast around the world, and this magnificent pageantry, as it were, kind of get that kind of image in your mind. Oh, this is on a much holier scale than whatever was done for royalty in those countries. Okay, where am I? and they continued sounding the trumpets until they reached the ground. Until they reached the gate through which one exits to the east from the women's courtyard to the eastern slope of the Temple Mount. When they reached the gate through which one exits to the east, they turned from facing east to facing west. You'd think they might just make a right turn to go south where they're headed, which is that pool where they're going to be drawing the water. But first, they exit to the east and then they turn around and face the way that they have come, meaning back toward the temple. Why? They turn from from facing east to facing west toward the Holy of Holies. And they said, our ancestors who were in this place during the first temple period, who did not conduct themselves appropriately, stood with their backs toward the sanctuary of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun toward the east. And our eyes are to God. And Rabbi Yehuda says that they would repeat and say, we are to God and our eyes are to God, right? So it's like, because our ancestors didn't merit to keep the temple in their midst at the end of the first temple period, later when the temple was reestablished, they added to the ceremonies of the temple that we don't want to make the same mistakes as our ancestors made, who lost, the merit of having the first temple in their midst. Tragically, we eventually lost the merit to have the second temple in our midst. So we might well ask, what mistakes did our ancestors make, and that we are going to go out of our way to avoid making the same mistakes? One of those, and our sages say, is baseless hatred among Jews, right? We're really commanded to love our fellow Jew and to act like we love our fellow Jew. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara. The sages taught, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of water never saw celebration in his life. One who did not see Jerusalem in its glory never saw a beautiful city. One who did not see the temple in its constructed state never saw a magnificent structure. The Gemara asks, what is the temple building to which the sages refer? And Abaye said, and some say that it was Rav Chisda who said, this is referring to the magnificent building of Herod who renovated the second temple. And the Gemara asks, with what materials did Herod construct it? And Rava said it was with stones of green-gray marble and white marble. Some say it was with stones of blue marble and white marble. And the rows of stones were set with one row slightly protruded and one row slightly indented so that the plaster would take better. And he thought to plate the temple with gold. But the sages said to him, leave it as it is and do not plate it with gold, as it is better this way. Same lesson that we learned about the flute of Moses, right? It produced a beautiful sound. They tried to put gold on it to make it even better, and they ruined it. They had to remove the gold. Leave it as it is better this way, as with the different colors and the staggered arrangement of the rows of stones, it has the appearance of waves of the sea. Isn't that beautiful? So, why is that? Why is that an image which appeals to the sages? Now, were they saying that, Herod isn't going to understand the incredible spiritual significance of the temple as it is, but anyone can understand, that the ocean is beautiful, and so this will be a more convincing argument to Herod. Leave it alone. Don't put gold on it. That's just aggrandizing yourself as the guy who made a golden temple. It's beautiful as it is. Or is there a deeper spiritual thing here, that there is something about the ocean and the blue and the kind of movement, right, that's suggested in architecture, which carries an enhanced spirituality and is something to, aspire to produce in our own lives? I leave that question open. It is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, one who did not see, now that we have introduced this trope of one who did not see the temple in its full glory, haven't seen a beautiful structure, one who did not see the celebration of the Beis HaShoeva has not seen a celebration in all his days. Now they're going to do another kind of related teaching, one who did not see has not really seen. It is taught in Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, one who did not see the great synagogue of Alexandria of Egypt never saw the glory of Israel. This is a bizarre statement, right? One who did not see the great synagogue in Egypt never saw the glory of Israel. What? Obviously we're starting to refer to a later period, when Israel is really under the thumb of Rome, when things have been destroyed, the Second Temple has been destroyed, and he's making a kind of, a hyperbolic statement. Not that, there wasn't anything more glorious in the history of Israel. Obviously there was. The temples in Jerusalem were the glory of Israel. But in a later period, when those were destroyed, the most magnificent Jewish structure in the world was this synagogue in Alexandria. Now, this is also a little bit like, what? It's uncomfortable for us because we know that there's a commandment in the Torah which said that after God redeemed us from slavery in Egypt, we're commanded never return to Egypt. Do not dwell in Egypt. Jews should not be living in Egypt. And yet, there's going to be important, prominent, large Jewish community in Egypt, right? How is it that happens? We'll get to that in a moment. First, the teaching about this. So Rabbi Yehuda says, one who did not see the great synagogue of Alexandria of Egypt never saw the glory of Israel. They said that its structure was like a large basilica with a colonnade within a colonnade. At times, there were 600,000 men and another 600,000 men in it. Okay, so I think we're in the world of hyperbole here when it says that this building held 1.2 million people, twice the number of those who left Egypt. In it, and so he's already acknowledging, it's not like he forgot to mention that, when we left Egypt, we weren't supposed to go back there. He's acknowledging that he knows that law very well. Nevertheless, there was this big, beautiful Jewish community in Egypt later, and they had a magnificent synagogue. In it, there were 71 golden chairs corresponding to the 71 members of the Great Sanhedrin, each of which consisted of no less than 21,000 talents of gold. This was a wealthy community that really made a magnificent synagogue with golden chairs and vessels, etc. And there was a wooden platform at the center. The sexton of the synagogue would stand on it with the scarves in his hand. And because the synagogue was so large and the people could not hear the communal prayer, when the prayer leader reached the conclusion of blessing, requiring the people to answer Amen, the sexton waved the scarf, and then all the people knew to answer Amen. And the members of the various crafts would not sit mingled. Rather, the goldsmiths would sit among themselves, and the silversmiths among themselves, and the blacksmiths among themselves, and the coopersmiths among themselves, and the weavers among themselves. And when a poor stranger entered there, he would recognize people who plied his craft, and he would turn to join them there. And from there, he would secure his livelihood as well as the livelihood of the members of his household, as his colleagues would find him work in that craft. Now, from here, you have an early example of this idea that, first of all, you don't want to give somebody charity. If you don't want to give a person a fish, if you can possibly give him a fishing pole, right? Give him a way to earn his own livelihood. And you do that for people in your line of work, in your trade, as it were. The members of the guilds, as it were, sort of look out for each other. After depicting the glory of the synagogue, the Gemara relates that Abaye said, all the people who congregated in that synagogue were killed by Alexander the Great of Macedonia. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that they were punished and killed? It is due to the fact that they violated the prohibition with regard to Egypt. In this verse from Deuteronomy 17:16, you shall henceforth return no more that way. And they returned. Since they established their permanent place of residence in Egypt, they were punished. Now, what does Rav Steinsaltz say about this in terms of the law? The prohibition against settling in Egypt. It is prohibited for a Jew to settle in any part of Egypt. However, one who violates this prohibition is not punished with lashes, as it is considered a prohibition that does not involve an action. Now, despite the prohibition, the Rambam himself, Maimonides, perhaps the greatest interpreter of Torah in Jewish history, the Rambam himself settled there in Alexandria. And some say that the prohibition is specifically referring to leaving the land of Israel in order to go to live in Egypt. The Rambam came from Spain and he ended up in Alexandria. In any event, both earlier and later authorities wondered about this ruling, given the presence of a Jewish community in Egypt throughout the generations. Perhaps, since there is no prohibition against residing there temporarily, for business purposes and the like, Jews were not scrupulous in observing this law due to the exigencies of Jewish history. In other words, above all, save lives. And if Alexandria, for some reason, became like the one refuge in the storm when, Jews were being killed everywhere else and it was just dangerous to live anywhere else, it was impossible to practice Judaism freely, but in Alexandria they had that freedom, then perhaps that was why there was an exception to this law. Furthermore, if there is an element of mitzvah motivating one's presence in Egypt, it is permitted to reside there. So if you're somehow fulfilling other Torah obligations by living in Egypt, then you may reside there. If you're thinking about moving to Egypt, consult with a rabbi first. With respect to answering Amen, as they did in that very large synagogue where, they didn't have microphones, obviously, couldn't have used them on Shabbos anyway, but it was so large that they couldn't hear the prayer leader, what he was saying, so they wouldn't know when to answer Amen, so the sexton would wave a scarf. What is the law on this? If one is obligated to recite a blessing, and he knows the prayer leader is presently reciting that very blessing, he may answer Amen only if he can hear the blessing being recited. That is the conclusion drawn by halachic authorities based on the Gemara in Tractate Brachos. Some say that even if he is not obligated to recite the blessing, he should answer Amen only if he knows which blessing is being recited. So the scarf system would work according to that view, that you know what blessing is being recited. But generally speaking, you shouldn't say Amen unless you actually heard the thing you're saying Amen to, particularly in the case of a blessing. And finally, 2 more paragraphs, and then I go to questions and comments. The Mishna continues, at the conclusion of the festival day, etc., the priests and the Levites descended from the Israelite courtyard to the women's courtyard, where they would introduce a significant repair. And the Gemara asks, what is this significant repair? And Rabbi Elazar said that it is like that which we learned. The walls of the women's courtyard were smooth, without protrusions initially. Subsequently, they affixed protrusions to the wall surrounding the women's courtyard. Each year thereafter, for the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water, they placed wooden planks on these projections and surrounded the courtyard with a balcony. And they instituted that the women should sit above and the men below. So that's the origin of the women's balcony. A lot of traditional synagogues have that setup where the women sit upstairs and the men sit downstairs. In Orthodox synagogues, the men and women are going to sit separately. Some synagogues make that division. There's like a wall, a mechitza running down the middle of the synagogue, men on one side, women on the other. Others make that separation with a balcony. There was a charming movie made a few years ago, I think it was called The Balcony, where a new rabbi came to town and he said, this is ridiculous. The women are up there too far removed from the service. We should do the system where they all sit on the same floor. And the women were furious because they liked sitting up in the balcony where they could chat amongst themselves and look down at the men and see what was going on with them. They could see everything, and they didn't like being behind a wall rather than looking down with a bird's eye view and seeing everything. Interesting movie. The sages taught in the Tosefta, initially women would stand on the inside of the women's courtyard, closer to the sanctuary to the west, and the men were on the outside in the courtyard and on the rampart. So originally the women were closer and the men were on the outside, but they would come to conduct themselves with inappropriate levity in each other's company, as the men needed to enter closer to the altar when the offerings were being sacrificed, and they wanted to see it, and as a result, they would mingle with the women. Therefore, the sages instituted that the women should sit on the outside and the men on the inside. But still, then the women would come closer during the offerings, and there was mingling, and the people conducted themselves with inappropriate levity. Therefore, they instituted, in the interest of complete separation, that the women would sit above and the men below. That concludes our study of this daf, page 51 in Tractate Sukkah. Let me go to questions and comments. Okay, Sharon, our friend Sam Glazer, our mutual friend, always said that the ideal time for a Jewish wedding in Jerusalem is right after Sukkot, after 7 days of celebration for Sukkot, and then you had the 7 days of the Sheva Brachas, right? So when there's a Jewish wedding, you have 7 days of celebrating it, and so I guess Sam said that's the way to party, 7 days of Sukkot partying, and then 7 days of partying for the wedding, and then you really get into that celebratory frame of mind. Nina had to go out to pick up our son at school. Let me just see if there are any other questions in the comments that I can scan quickly. Yehuda said in Hungary we sit upstairs too. And where did I just see a comment about the men of action that looked interesting? It's just hard to scan. You guys are having an interesting conversation about Passover Haggadahs, and somebody mentioned the Geniza in Cairo, right? So that is that Jewish community that was there for, literally thousands of years. And there, when you have an old book, a Jewish prayer book or a book of scripture that wears out, can no longer be used, so you can't just throw that in the trash, right? It has God's name in it, has acquired holiness. So what you'll do is you'll put it temporarily in a geniza, which is a storage place for these holy books that are awaiting burial. And then eventually, you actually bury them in the ground the same way that you would bury a body, that no longer carries the soul, and it gets buried in the ground. And books with God's name in it are supposed to be buried in the same way, but it's not always convenient to dig the hole, so they await burial in the Geniza. And the Geniza in Cairo sort of received these Jewish documents for centuries. Then it got sealed off, and then I think in the late 1800s, it was found, and it was just one of the greatest treasures to archaeologists and scholars and clergy trying to understand Jewish history. They learned so much from the Geniza in Cairo. Sharon says, I'm a book pushover. Just check out my library. So Sharon, you and me and Nina have that in common. We are book people. And I give credit to my father. I guess I'll just end with this. My father's birthday is tomorrow, so big happy birthday to my dad. And we were not rich people growing up, and my parents were very economical in what they would spend money on. We had a very limited and strict allowance, and we were careful in what we spent money on. But the one area where my father would just open that wallet freely was books. And we used to go to Barnes and Noble in New York City. I think they had a branch at like 5th Avenue and 18th Street. It was around there. Big bookstore. This is when that was Barnes and Noble. It wasn't a chain store where there's Barnes and Nobles everywhere. I think that was the Barnes and Noble. But we would go in there, and my father said, "Get whatever you want, so long as you read it." Right? So he was always very generous with books, but you can't just buy books to populate your shelf. Any book you buy, you're committing to read it. And I thought that was a great principle that my dad exercised, and a tribute to him on his 78th birthday, which is tomorrow, but it's Shabbos, so we'll celebrate it today. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Motzi Shabbos, about, maybe half an hour, 45 minutes after Shabbos ends here in LA. Tomorrow's daf has a whole bunch of really beautiful, kind of philosophical, folkloric, interesting teachings. That's going to be a good show. And then for those who are going to Slichos, it's a beautiful ceremony. I don't know if I'll be able to broadcast that or not. I'll see if I can. Probably not. But after midnight on this, final Saturday, before we go into the final days toward Rosh Hashanah, there's Slichos, and there are these beautiful, moving, emotional, penitential prayers that we sing, and that is going to be done tomorrow night. So Slichos, watch for that. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got. All the best. Good Shabbos.